Welcome everyone. Today in Giraffe, we're going to be learning how to draw. So an exciting feature and a great place to start if you're new to the platform, as we'll be covering off some of the basic shape tools that we see up the top here in the drawing toolbar and how to interact and configure them to suit your project needs, along with some other tips and tricks on how you can draw in an efficient manner, along with aligning the grid and editing the grid to suit your project orientation. So I've done a little bit of setting up in the background for this project. I've loaded in the cadastre layer here on the left-hand side, and I've also added a drawing layer, the How to Draw 101 layer here. And I've also selected my site boundary, which we can see here if I zoom in on the corner of Boyce Street and Mansfield Street. So I've got an amalgamated lot for this demonstration, and I'll be looking to draw some geometry from this site. All right, so the first feature I want to cover off, which is quite a common workflow within Giraffe, is the right-click create feature. So what we can do is actually right-click on the map, and you'll see that it's actually loaded some information, which is the active layers that I have visible on the map. It's sort of gone away and pulled that information in. And so now what I can do is actually interact with that data. And so as I scroll down, I've got a project boundary as a sort of subheading here, and I can actually create geometry directly from this information. So I could do that with the cadastre information as well, and it would just select that single lot, as you can see outlined in red. However, I want to create a geometry aligned to my entire project boundary. So I'm going to create, and now I've got one large geometry that I can now interact with. We can also edit the geometry that we create by clicking on it, and we get a number of transformation controls appear. So if I zoom in here, we've got some arrows here which will allow us to push and pull that geometry. And we can also be quite precise with that extrusion as well. So if I select 3 on my keyboard, it will snap to 3 meters from that site boundary. And I can do the same all the way around. And then maybe it's 2 to the side adjacent boundary here. And the right-click create feature isn't limited to the cadastre or the project boundary. You can apply that to any active layer on the drawing. And so I currently have a 3D buildings layer that's active, and I can see that on the left-hand side in my layers panel. And if I right-click in the vicinity of, say, this building here, I actually call upon that information. And if I scroll down here, I can see that building outlines highlight, and I can directly create a geometry from that information, which is quite nice. And I can take that a step further and actually take on the properties of that building in my geometry creation. So I can hoist that in the properties panel, and we can see the properties get adopted here. But the main one I'm looking at is the height. So if I drag that away now, we've actually created a replica of that building there. And that might be helpful to create your surrounding context of your site. And now I'm just going to delete these geometries as I want to take a look at the grid feature. So I'm going to navigate up to my drawing toolbar at the top and hit the more drawing tools, the 3 dots at the end there. And I'm going to scroll down to snap and grid. And here I can toggle on my grid system. So if I click on grid, I can now see that overlaid on my site. So that's quite helpful. Well, at the moment, we need to make some slight adjustments for that to actually be helpful. So I'm going to jump back into the more drawing tools, go down to snap and grid, and I'm going to edit the grid. So I'm going to edit the grid, and I'm going to actually toggle into 2D mode for this. So I'm going to hit T on my keyboard, and I want the grid to be aligned to Boyce Street along this boundary here. So I'm going to hold S on my keyboard to snap to this corner of my boundary, and hold S again to snap to the adjacent corner. And what this does is define the squares of the grid. So now we can see that square takes up the entire length of my site boundary. And I also have an alignment in the way I view the map now. So this along Boyce Street is directly up the page, which is quite nice when I start to work on my site. We can also make better use of that grid as well. If we wanted to have, let's say, a 10-meter grid spread out across our site, we can go back up to the edit tool. So we're going to go back up into more drawing tools, snap and grid, and I'm going to hit edit grid once more. I'll hold S on this corner once again. However, this time I'm going to actually type 10 meters. And so what this does is snap the grid to that alignment, and I'm going to hold S and snap to my boundary once more. So if I click to finalize that, we can now see the grid system has been adjusted and we've got this new overlay across our site. So what I can actually do now, if I go up to, say, my polygon tool, and I'll talk to these in a second, but I can actually snap to these points that I've created. So just holding S, I can go through and start to create my building on my site and double click to finish. And so that leads us nicely into the basic drawing tools up the top, or the shape tools. So if I navigate to the drawing toolbar, select the shape tools option, and we've got a number of options here and their associated hotkeys there on the right hand side, which are always helpful. If you're familiar with other design software, your keyboard shortcut's going to help you out a ton. So I'm just going to select a rectangle from the top here, and let's hold S to snap to that corner there. And I want to define sort of the length of my rectangle. So you can see that's 20 meters, which is aligned to my grid, which is nice. And I can then snap to that grid further, and we've got a 30 by 20 meter rectangle. So there's more than one way to draw a rectangle as well. So that was the 3-point click there to create that rectangle method. And if I just delete that one for now, I can go back up to my rectangle tool, or I could hit R on my keyboard. And I can quite simply, if I hold S to snap to my origin point, I can actually just hold that initial click and I can drag. And so that will allow me to then do a nice quick drag, hold S to snap to the destination. And there we have exactly the same result with one less click. So depending on what your desired outcome is, there's a few ways that you can create that rectangle. You can also define the rectangle just as we did with the grid system by typing in the dimensions. So let's talk through that one as well. Going back up to rectangle, and maybe this one I won't use the grid to define the rectangle for this one. So I'm currently sort of in a freeform dimension, but I can override that with, say, typing 12 on my keyboard. And then if I hold Shift, that'll lock it into that 180-degree angle. So I click to define the length. And then as I drag out the width, I can override that once more and type in 20 and click to finalize that. So a few ways to create your rectangles, but definitely some options there. All right, so the next one that I want to talk through is the polygon tool. So we briefly touched on this earlier, and that was when I sort of traced around the grid. So let's just do that once more. Tracing around, so imagining this is some sort of building that we have going on the site, and double click to finish. So you will notice that I'm just going to drag that back and type 2 on my keyboard to offset that 2 from the site, from that boundary. And you will notice that I added one extra node here. And so that's just because I forgot to double click on the corner to finish that geometry that I was drawing. And if you do happen to do that, it's not the end of the world. We can actually just remove those nodes. So if I click on that, that disappears, and we can control that in one singular plane. So that's quite nice. But we can add segments to that geometry as well. So the same with the rectangle. We're obviously using the polygon here, but with the rectangle is much the same. And any geometry really in Giraffe, we have this editability to sort of push and pull the form. We can segment the form. So if I click that little plus button, it adds a node, and now I can drag that sort of independently and just as easily remove them as well. And so if I drag that down, what I can do is hold Shift, and you'll notice that it snaps to 90 degrees in those two angles. And so we get back to that rectilinear form where I started. So let's remove that one. You can obviously be quite liberal with the polygon tool as well. So I drew it in a more controlled manner, but if I jump in here to polygon, which is P on your keyboard as well, I could start to draw something quite creative and abstract if that was my intention. So you can just as easily create geometry like that as well. Just going to remove that and jump back into my shape tools and select the line. So very simple. This one is the line tool. Double click to finish, generates a line. And so I'll just delete that line And the last one I want to talk to is the point. So the point is how Giraffe understands circular geometry. As you'll see in the list here, there is no circular form. So if I click on the point here, and let's just drop a point here on the corner, it's this little gray dot that we can see here. But what we can do is actually add a property to that and offset that point to create that larger circular form. And so if I jump into properties, add an offset here, and then I can define that offset in the controls over here. So maybe it's a 20 meter offset, and we can see that reflected on the map. And maybe it is larger and more like 100 meters. So just going to hit enter there, and we've got our circular form that I could sort of drag around. And maybe this is a catchment area, which we can actually edit further to suit our map. So it's a little bit less bold on the map. And so I'm just going to add some more properties, and let's add a color and an opacity just to drop that down into the background a little bit. And we'll drop the opacity right down. So that's a little bit nicer. We can still see our project, and now we can see that surrounding catchment geometry. All right, so the last item, I'm just going to delete that circle, is the snap feature. So I'm going to demonstrate this using two rectangles. So if I go in here, quickly create rectangle A, and then I'm going to hold Alt or Option on my keyboard and create sort of two more here on my site. So you will notice when you click and drag geometry, you can see some lines highlighting, and that's the snap feature. So if I start to drag this geometry, and we can see that auto snap, similar to other software that you might use, an auto snap feature. And so that's quite nice when you're just moving geometry around in a fluid sort of fashion, and you can start to get that alignment quite quickly. So let's say if this one was a little bit smaller, and let's drag these two to the front here, and I want to drag this, and so you can see it snaps on the right alignment there, in the center, and then on the left-hand side, and maybe we want to drag it up there. And so we get two snap points there, and we can drop the shape. So the alignment runs along the back of this rectangle here and along the side here. So a great little feature to be aware of when you're drawing in Giraffe. All right, so that's everything. We will see you in the next one.